In Parashat Ahare, one of the first things that we learn about is an important aspect of the Yom Kippur service. The first several Pesukim of the Parasha explain that Aharon HaKohen is to take 2 goats from Bnei Israel, Shtei Seirei Izim, and conduct a goral, which we usually understand as a lottery. And this goral will designate one of the goats as a korban chatat on behalf of Bnei Israel, and the other goat will be for Azazel and sent away into the wilderness as a kapara. The pasuk says l'chaper alav. And this second goat is commonly known as the seir hamishtalech, which just means the goat that is sent away. So after doing the goral and sacrificing the seir intended for the chatat, the Pesukim explained that the Kohen Gadol should place his hands on the seir for Azazel and do a vidui, or a confession, for all of the nation's sins. Then the seir will be let loose into the midbar, basically carrying all of the sins of Bnei Israel. This is literally, the pasuk says, "V'nasa hasair alav et kol avonotam." Now, when I read these pesukim describing the seir hamishtalech, something that troubles me is this notion of a goral and its place in the Yom Kippur service. Because it seems kind of odd to introduce this notion of chance or even randomness into Yom Kippur. I'm thinking, wouldn't a better message be that the proper actions and deeds and teshuvah is what informs the message of Yom Kippur, instead of a lottery, which, like I said, carries with it this notion of chance, randomness, etc. So to explore this question, I wanted to look at the commentary of Abravanel on these pesukim and his treatment of the seir hamishtalech, which he treats extensively, but I'm just going to focus on part of it. Based on a midrash, we know that the 2 goats for this goral have to be exactly equal, or shavim, in appearance, stature, etc. But Abravanel asks, why? Why do the goats have to be so similar? And then he asks, why does the Torah specify that the Kohen Gadol should determine which seir is designated for the korban and which one is sent to Azazel using a lottery? Why can't the Kohen just on his own, verbally, decide this seir is going to be for Azazel? So the Abravanel says that the 2 goats here are actually a remez to 2 opposite attributes of the collective nation of Bnei Israel. And that is why the goats have to be shavim, because they essentially represent 2 sides of the same coin. On the one hand, sometimes Bnei Israel act appropriately. We keep the mitzvot, we stay on the path outlined for us in the Torah, and when we follow the Torah, says Abravanel, we are like the seir that is offered for the chatat, because we are worthy of metaphorically entering the Kodesh HaKodashim and basking in God's glory. Other times, unfortunately, we distance ourselves from God, and then we are like the seir that is sent to Azazel. Abravanel explains that Azazel is composed of 2 words, Az, which means contemptuous or rebellious, and Azal, which means to go. And so when Bnei Israel rebel against God, we are shunned from our land and sent off into the proverbial wilderness, into the midbar, without the Torah to guide us, just like the seir that is designated for Azazel. It's also sent into the wilderness, sent away from everyone else. With this remez in mind, Abravanel then explains the notion of the goral in this context. He says, based on a pasuk from Daniel, that the word goral here in Ahare is not just indicative of a lottery, but rather indicates sechar. And this sechar is by definition determined not based on chance, but rather on God's hashgacha. And in this instance, with the goral for the 2 goats, the goral is not simply a random lottery. It represents the potential sechar that we as a nation can receive if we follow the path set out for us by the Torah. So what I take away from this is a message that is, of course, fit for Yom Kippur, but that certainly applies all year round. We cannot fully understand how God mitigates sechar ve'onesh, how God rewards or punishes. My question that I asked said, isn't a more comforting, essentially, message for Yom Kippur that we know how things are going to turn out? and that there's a plan in place and we know how God works and how Teshuvah works, that would be nice. The truth is we don't always know exactly how Sechar Va'onesh works. But there is a balance to that this Abravanel, I think, highlights, which is that there is a certain blueprint that God has given us with the mitzvot. And with that blueprint, we can always do our best to engage with the Torah, to align ourselves with the mitzvot, and pray that we will merit the ultimate sechar from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So with that, I want to wish everyone a Shabbat Shalom, and thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit of Torah this week.